Okay. Good afternoon once again. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, that is, I can hear you loud and clear now. Happy New Year to you. I hope you guys had hello? I hope you guys had a good holiday.
Yeah, that's fine.
Are you guys here? Can you hear me? Or am I speaking to myself now? It's on to me.
I can hear just fine.
Oh, that's great. Marcel, how are you?
Doing well.
Thanks.
Okay. Okay. Ranja,
Yes, hello.
can you hear me? How are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
Linda,
Yeah, I'm here. I'm fine too.
Vincent, can Vincent hear us?
Yes. Hi.
Okay. How are you?
I'm doing fine. Thanks.
Okay. Dennis,
Yeah, I'm here. I'm fine. Thanks for asking.
Dennis fine too.
Yeah, I'm good.
Ivan,
Hello.
how are you?
It's okay.
Okay, that's great. Who am I missing? I guess I've picked up on all of you, right? Okay, that's great. Okay, yeah. So we can continue on that space. As much as possible, I know we're just coming back into the system, so I'm not going to bore us with a whole lot of stuff. Today's class is going to be a very short one, and we just do the little, we do the best we can do, and then we move on. Before we continue with what we're supposed to do today, quickly I will need to ask, how is your assignment coming along? Are we winning with the assignment? Is there any challenge that you may want to talk about, or you are all fine?
No, I think it's an interesting topic. I think it's just fine.
I can't hear you. Can you speak into your mic, please?
1 second.
Okay. Just going to read from the chat. Okay. You need to switch off your mic. Switch on your microphone. Okay, fine. While we wait on let me see, switching on microphone. While we wait on Dennis to switch on his microphone, do we have anybody having any challenge with the assignment, or we are all fine? Like I always say, silence is consent. Are you guys ready for the assignments at, I think we're submitting this weekend, right?
Yes, I think so.
Okay, so that's
the 19th, right?
19th, yeah.
Next
19th,
week?
oh, that will be next week, yeah.
Yeah.
19th will be next week Tuesday. Okay, so if that is sorted, then let's just move ahead with what we need to do today. So today we'll be looking at globalization and international law. Marcel, are you about saying something? Okay, like I said, we'll be looking at globalization and international law. That's what we'll be looking at today. And I suppose the class will still have maybe 3-4 topics to look at. before the end of the session itself. So sometimes in February, I think the first or second week of February, we should be done with the class. And we'll also be asking you towards the end of the session for an assessment of the class itself and what you have been able to gather thus far. So today we'll be looking at globalization and international law. So when we talk about globalization, I suppose you are not hearing this for the first time. So can I hear from you guys what you think globalization is? Let's talk on globalization. What is globalization? The floor is open. Who wants to start?
Can you hear me now? Hello?
Yeah. We can hear you, Dennis.
Ah, okay, nice.
Okay.
I would say the connection of the world.
Connection of the world. That's beautiful. The connection of the world. Yeah. Any other addition to that? Globalization as the connection of the world.
I think it means that the world is getting more and more connected. For example, 100 years ago, Germany was not as much in contact with China as it is now, and it's getting more and more.
Want to go by the example now, we say that if not for globalization, of which we will not be having this class in the first place. I'm all the way here in Africa. I'm in South Africa, and we are all in Europe, and we can talk in real time. We can talk in real time. This is also the benefit of globalization over time. But when you look at it from this space, we'll still explain what globalization, we'll still conceptualize globalization, we'll give it a definition. But just speaking up from this example of connectedness that you guys raised now, is to say that globalization is influenced, or yeah, globalization is influenced or is propelled by technology. Technological advancement is the bedrock of globalization. So the world is becoming more connected as a result of the advancements in technology. This is me jumping ahead of the lecture, but since you raised it, let's just quickly talk about it. That globalization is as a result of technological advancement. So when we talk about globalization, yes, we're talking about connectedness of the world, right? We're talking about the connectedness of the world. That's what it implies when we discuss globalization. So we say globalization. Uh, it's actually difficult to pin down what globalization itself implies, but we said it is the emergence of a complex web of interconnectedness. That is what globalization is. It is this coming together of the world, or better still, another definition to globalization is to say globalization is the gradual removal of state borders, the the fusion of both economic, social, and political, socio-economic, social, and political aspects of the world. The coming together of this is what we refer to as globalization. So you see the diagram we have here. It is a complex interconnection. Africa is connecting to Europe, at the same time is connecting to South and North America, is connecting to Australia, is connecting to Asia, and the same thing is happening. So there's practically no linear connection in the world. And like you said, some 50, 100 years ago, this was a difficult practice, right? But with the advancements in technology, globalization becomes more complex. The web itself becomes more complex. So globalization is practically just a web of connection in the world. And Haywood defined globalization. Haywood defined globalization as regardless of form or impact, it implies connection, like we said. It implies connection. That's basically what we discuss when we talk about globalization. It talks about connection of the world. I suppose you are familiar with the term when they say the world is becoming a global village. The world is becoming a small space, whereby the example you just gave now, what is happening in Germany has a whole lot to do with what is happening in China. There's an influence on things that are happening around the world. And in our class, I think maybe in the first or second week, we also said it when we were discussing the American election, to say the things that are happening in America has an effect on what is happening in our immediate locality. And that's how it flows. What is happening in your locality also has influence on what's happening in another locality. And you can come up with a whole lot of stuff when we talk about that. So basically, that is the essence of, that is what we mean when we discuss globalization. When we discuss globalization, there are dimensions to globalization. Practically, we have three dimensions to globalization. We have the economic globalization, we have the cultural globalization, and we have the political globalization. These are the three dimensions to globalization. So when we talk about the economic globalization, first and foremost, what I need you to get when we talk about globalization is the absorption, the coming together of borders, the taking away of state borders. What demarcates us? For instance, now, the boundaries, the taking away boundaries of states is practically what globalization is, right? Each state has its boundaries, has its territory, right? What globalization does is to take away that thing that differentiates us. What makes us different is what globalization comes to take away, in such a way that we now gradually become one. So basically, that's what globalization is all about. So I'll talk about economic globalization as a dimension of globalization. We're talking about the process whereby national economies become absorbed into a single global economy, right? The taking away of economic borders around the world, state economic borders. Before now, you need to, when you talk about trades and economic interaction and the likes, possibly you'll be talking about state interactions and all. But now you realize that we have multinational companies and even individuals that operates in different countries of the world, in different states of the world. That is economic globalization, a space whereby the economies of the world are gradually becoming one. You can easily relate to that when you look at, say, the European Union, for instance. You understand that the European Union operates a system of government that is unified within Europe, right? And the economies are technically unified in as much as each state, each unit within the European Union has certain rights and certain powers in which they enjoy. They tend to have a unified front within the global system. And that's what is happening in the world. World economy, state economy are gradually eroding to become a unified economy. So that's what we imply when we talk about economic globalization. And then we'll talk about cultural globalization. We're talking about a situation whereby the way of life of people are infused all around, right? What is happening in this particular culture has influence on what is happening in another culture thousands of miles away. I'll give you a perfect example. How many of us are hip hop fans? Do we have hip hop fans here? You listen to hip hop music?
Not really.
Okay. So what type of music do you listen to? Let's start with that. We can use any example.
Like rock or metal.
Okay, rock. If you pick any of this, musical genres, for instance, rock, hip hop, blues, R&B, country music, and the likes, you realize that most of this music emanated, they speak to the culture of possibly the author, the musician itself. They speak to a particular culture, right? Over time, we tend to want to embrace that culture, even when it is outside our own culture. What is happening within that space is what we refer to as cultural globalization. A space whereby people tend to practice so a particular way of life that is different from the way of life in which they are familiar with, right? For instance, say even in our way of dressing, in our dress sense, when you dress in a particular way, they can look at your dressing, for instance, and say you are English, you are German, you are French, right? You are African. But you realize that globalization is getting to a space whereby until I tell you where I'm from, it may be difficult for you to say I am French or German or English, because what is happening is the culture is becoming infused over time. These cultures are becoming infused. So the culture that is happening in a particular locality is practiced in other localities that are miles, thousands of miles away from the origin of those culture, right? So that is what we imply when we discuss cultural globalization, the interconnectedness of culture in such a way that what is happening here have an effect on what is happening in another space. Another perfect example you may want to look at when you talk about cultural globalization is even in language. Even in language, right? English is not our first language. Most of us, English is not our first language. For me, for instance, English is not my first language. For some of you guys, I suppose English is also not your first language. You get the idea. But now you realize that we are communicating in English. Why? This communication in English is cultural globalization. There has been a fusion of the language. Culture itself is not just what we do. It also involves our language. It involves everything we do, our way of life in general. So that is cultural globalization. The movement of that. And now and another thing okay, I think I will explain. Let me just explain that quickly. When it comes to the space of cultural globalization, as with economic and political globalization, remember we said that power is the currency of the world, right? You remember we said that power is the currency of the world, and who has power determines what happens in the world, right? Who has power controls everything. And so with globalization, the flow of globalization and the development of globalization is influenced by power dynamics in the world. So now when we look at cultural globalization, for instance, we are speaking in English. We are doing things within this space because the Anglophones have, over time, historically, they had stronger control of the world. They were the hegemon for a very long time, right? They were the world powers for a long time. From the British hegemon, you now have the America as the hegemon. So you see, English was their way of was English or is the lingua franca in this space. English is is the language. So because of that, it became easy for English to flow down to other space of the world, right? Because they were the ones that were in power. So it was easy for us to take on that culture. So that itself is cultural globalization. Now, what you will notice now is that the fight between the United States and its and our allies and China, you will realize that now there is a consciousness around the world for people to learn Mandarin, right? As opposed to people learning English. So you see, there's another flow in different countries of the world. Now there's a consciousness to learn Mandarin. Why are we learning Mandarin? Because China is gradually becoming a superpower. It's gradually becoming a power to reckon with in the international system. So these are some of the things in which you should just take note. They are not explicit. It's not something you read on the papers. There are things you need to infer, right? That the culture continues to flow within this space. So that's what we imply when we discuss cultural globalization. And then we'll discuss political globalization. We're talking about a situation whereby now we are gradually having a world government, right? The fusion of the politics, decision making and responsibility of states becoming a joint affairs, a global affair. For instance, issues in the world now, basic issues, fundamental issues of the world are discussed within the global platform, the United Nations and the like. They're discussed within the global platform. Things like climate change is discussed within the global platform. Things like even pandemics, the COVID-19 we find ourselves now. Decisions on this and the responsibility of state and the likes are discussed within the global space. So that is what political globalization. The situation whereby we now start having the space of government operating within the global space. So these are the three aspects of globalization: economic globalization, the fusion of the economies of the world; cultural globalization, the fusion of the cultural difference being flattened out, and the flow of cultures around the world. And then we have political globalization, which talks about the fusion of governments when it comes to decision making and responsibilities in the world. So basically, these are stuff in which you should be familiar with. And this is a question need to be I want you to look at. How does the arena of international relation impact on your work? Discuss examples and case studies. I suppose this is your assignment, right? Are you guys with me?
Yeah.
I suppose this was your assignment, right? This was the assignment question.
Kind of.
I'm just going to leave it the way it is here. So just think around it. How does the arena of international relations impact on your world within the space of this dimension we talk about? Like I said, what is happening in this space has an effect on what is happening in other space. So now when we talk about globalization, we want to look at state and globalization, right? And we said the emergence of the phenomenon of globalization has stimulated debates around the world as relating to power and the significance of states within the international system. So there are three school of thoughts that we tend to focus on. We look at the hyper-globalist view on globalization, the relationship between globalization and the state. We look at the realist view on the relationship between the globalization and the state, and then we look at the globalist. These are the three schools of thought in which we tend to consign ourselves with. The idea of these three school of thought is, in simple terms, to explain to us the relationship between globalization, or better still, what is the position of the states in the globalized world. That is basically what they tend to look at. What is the position of the state? Because the background to this is the argument we make between realism and liberalism, to say that the state is the most important actor within the international system. Now, as a result of globalization, we say globalization is now taking away boundaries in the world. So what is the relevance of the state within the international system? And that is the argument of these people. And these three school of thought have different view as relating to the position of the states within the international system. So for the hyper-globalists, they believe that globalization implies the end of sovereign governments, right? You know, when we define state, we say the state must have sovereignty, the ability to make decisions without interference, both internally and externally. But for the hyper-globalists, they believe that with the emergence of globalization, what it implies is that globalization and states cannot coexist. So the more globalization, the more we have the development of globalization implies the decline in the relevance of states. So the state will not become a relevant actor if globalization continues to project. So basically, that's the argument of the hyper-globalists. They said the decline, the decline of the states is the increase of globalization. So the more globalization increases, the more you have state sovereignty going down the drain. So the more you have state sovereignty increasing, then it implies that globalization also will have to what? Go down. So invariably, globalization and the states are what? Are on opposite ends of each other. So one increases, the other decreases. So that's what the hyper-globalists argue. Are we together? Then the realists argue that no matter what happens, no matter the developments of globalization, the state will continuously be the primary determinants of affairs within the international system. So the argument here is that the state will continuously be relevant despite the development in globalization. So you see, the realists and the hyper-globalists are two extreme positions. The hyper-globalists believe that with globalization, the state will decline. The realists believe that with globalization, either no matter what happens with globalization, the state will still remain. The state will still be the principal actor within the international system. So that's the argument of the realists. And then the globalists is the globalists are now the middle ground between the realists and the hyper-globalists. They are the middle ground. They believe that yes, there is globalization. They acknowledge the fact that there is globalization, and they also acknowledge the fact that states will still operate within the international system. But the argument is that the role and significance of the state will change. There will be a transformation in what the state will do once globalization increases. So with the increase in globalization, the role of the states and the nature of sovereignty will have to change. So basically, these are the arguments of the globalists. So within globalists, the globalist view. So they talk about these three changes that will happen to sovereignty. So they believe that sovereignty will change, and they believe that these are the kind of changes that is likely to happen. So first, we'll talk about the supra-territoriality. Then second, we'll talk about the shift in economic sovereignty. And then we'll talk about pooled sovereignty. So basically, these are the changes in which they believe will happen within globalization. So what do we mean by supra-territoriality? Just the way we explained that globalization is what? Is the taking away of world borders, taking away of state borders, the gradual erosion in state borders. So that is what supra-territoriality means. It implies that states, the territories of states, each state has its borders, right? Its geographical distance and the likes. That with globalization, what will happen is that there will be a decline in these territorial locations. There will be a decline. There will be an erosion of boundaries. Now there will now be a fusion of these states in such a way that the world will now become borderless. So you will not have a situation whereby if you travel down, say Germany now, and you travel down south or north or east or wherever, you get to the end of the border, and possibly you get to a space and say, okay, this is the border between Germany and France, right? Or this is the border between France and the United Kingdom, or this is the border between Denmark and Norway, and on like that. There will not be a space of border. So you just move in from a space to the other with no regard for border. So we are going to be having what we refer to as, quote and unquote, the global citizen space. Interaction become the space of transborder interaction. So communications and interaction becomes transborder and transglobal as it is. So basically, that's the space of supra-territoriality. In simple terms, it implies the shrinking of state border in such a way that the world become borderless, right? You just move around. So when I meet you, you are not going to be telling me you are a German or you are Swedish or you are French, or to me, for instance, I will tell you I'm a Nigerian or I'm a South African. So this we be eroded. So basically, that's the space of supra-territoriality. And then the globalists also believe that another thing that will change is that there's going to be a shift in economic sovereignty, right? There will be a shift in economic sovereignty. Presently, what we have is that the states are the ones that determine the economy of the state. The state determine the markets. They determine the flow of markets. But what we will be having over time is that the markets will now be the determinants within the international system. So where we used to have the state as masters, we now start having what? The masters being transferred to the market now becomes the master of itself. The market controls itself. It will not be controlled again by states. The flow, the demand and supply becomes what controls the markets, international markets as it is. So basically, that's the space of the shift in economic sovereignty. So first, we talk about the fact that the market becomes the controller of itself, right? It goes on autopilots. I guess we can use the word that markets will now go on autopilot. That's what the globalists believe, that with globalization, markets goes on autopilot in the sense that they become the controller of the flow in markets. And then states will no longer be acting alone. They will be acting in unity with other states. And that's why we have things like the G20, the G77, the IMF, the World Trade Organization, WTO, the World Bank. They become operational in a more advanced scale, in a more enlarged scale. So basically, that's what we'll be doing within the space of the shifts in economic sovereignty. And then the another space in which you are going to be, the globalists argue, is what we refer to as what? Pool sovereignty. And what do we imply by pool sovereignty? The European Union is a perfect example of pool sovereignty. A situation whereby two or more states come together. They bring their sovereignty together so that they can operate in a more, they can operate together as a stronger force. So within the international system, globalization will lead to a situation whereby standing alone becomes dangerous. Standing alone will not be to the economic or political or security advantage of any state. So the only way for survival is for states to come together, to combine their strengths together, and to live as one. So that's the argument of the globalists. So you see, within the space of the argument of the globalists, you realize that the Brexit, for instance, the argument would be that Brexit is a dangerous movement by the United Kingdom, right? It's a dangerous movement on the ground that the international system is growing in the space whereby unity is expected of states. So when you stand alone, it becomes difficult to operate. So basically, these are the argument of the globalists. And then again, they argue that there is going to be state transformation, right? Now we're going to have the space of collective states that we have discussed. Collective states in the sense that states become the argument of pool sovereignty becomes operational here. So again, another argument on that collective state is that states become they start abolishing private enterprise and then set up a centrally planned economy, like a socialist system. The states we start operating within this space like a socialist system, whereby the economy of the state is planned from a central space, a central command system. A perfect example is the former USSR, whereby everything was centrally planned. And then they also say that another type of states that are in operation is what referred to as the welfare state. The welfare state takes prime responsibility for social welfare of its citizens. That's what the welfare state is all about. It is that social responsibility, issue of health, issue of education, and the different services, security, social security, and the like, is organized by the state. So we say that is what? That is a welfare state. And another type of transformation that will happen is the competitive or market states. The market state is a capitalist state in the sense of it. A state that pursues strategies to ensure long-term competitiveness within the globalized economy. So these are the transformations that will be happening within the state. And here we said this is both pre and post globalization. So basically that's the state, that's the aspects of globalization. And as long as there is globalization, as long as states becomes infused together, there's a need for us to have what is referred to as a code of conduct, right? Rules and regulation that we need to abide by. In any space whereby 2 or 3 people are, there's a need for what? There's a need for rules and regulation, right? And that is where the international law comes to play. So when we discuss international law, we say international law are rules and regulation and principle that governs the interaction of states, or the interaction of states and non-state actors within the international system. In essence, that is just what it is. There are rules, body of rules and regulation that governs the interaction of states and non-state actors within the international system. We said that as long as there's interaction of people, there's a need for us to have rules that will determine our behavior within the international system. And basically that is what international law is all about. So the international law sets the rules that stipulate the ways in which states we cooperate or compete with each other, right? They determine how that will happen. They also prescribe acceptable and unacceptable behavior. What behavior is acceptable? And which of this behavior is also not acceptable? That is what the international law is all about. And these laws are what are mutually acceptable by all states. And these laws are also formalized by international agreements. Because if these laws are not formalized, then they are not laws. If we don't agree to live together in harmony, then that becomes a challenge within the international system. So for those laws to be effective, it must be agreed and it must be enacted by all. So basically that's the essence of international law. So who are the subjects of international law? Who are the subjects of international law? When we mean subject of international law, we imply that in another word, we are asking who or what does international law apply? Who are supposed to be under those laws, and who are supposed to act within this within the law? So first we talk about nation states. States are subjects of international law. They must abide by international law. International organizations are also subject of international law. Multinational corporations are subject of international law. Non-governmental organizations and even individuals, we are all subjects of international law. So basically these are the subjects of international law. They must abide by international law. And then we'll talk about the adequacy of law. When we talk about the adequacy of law, we look at 3 prerequisites. For a law to be a law, for an international law to be a law, it must be legitimate. So we talk about legitimacy, acceptability, and enforceability. These are the 3 prerequisites for a law to be recognized as a law. So for the international law to be recognized as international law, it must fall within these 3 spaces. It must be legitimate. We'll talk about legitimacy, acceptability, and enforceability. What do we imply by legitimacy? It must be according to the law. it must be accepted by all. For you to refer to a particular instruction, a particular rule as international law, it must be accepted by all. It must be according to the law itself. It must be accepted by all. And most importantly, it must be enforceable. So if the law is accepted by all, it's according to the law, but it's not enforceable, then international law is not adequate in that space. So it must be enforceable. We must be able to enforce that law for it for us to say it's an adequate law. So, like we said, the law is a body of rules from a wide variety of sources. It is consciously created by states, authorities from different society. It's created by the state, and it must have widespread support and compliance. So basically, that's what we look at when we talk about the adequacy of the law. I think I want to pause here and quickly ask, am I too fast or you guys are fine?
So far, so good.
So far, so good. We are okay.
Yes.
Okay, that's perfect. So basically, this is the space we look at. In the adequacy of the law, like I said, these three things must happen. It must be according to the law, it must be acceptable, and it must be enforceable. Okay. So continue. What are the sources of international law? How do we come up with international law? How do we come up with international law? How do we come up with international law? So we talk about conventions, international convention as a source of international law. We talk about bilateral treaties, multilateral treaties that are negotiated by representatives of states, right? These are source of international law. These treaties, agreements, international agreements, both bilateral and multilateral. When we talk about bilateral, we're talking about agreements that are reached by two states. It's referred to as what bilateral, and then multilateral, more than two states. So these are a source of law. We'll talk about customs too. International custom as a source of law. And international customs are rules that require obligatory status, right? Due to their general acceptability. A custom is something, a general practice, right? A particular behavior that is accepted by all over time, right? If we over time accept a particular thing, then we said that becomes a custom, and it's a source of law. And then we'll talk about general principle of law recognized by individual states. So general laws that are recognized by individual states, there's a distinction between what is civilized and what is uncivilized, right? So but the point here is that when we talk about the general principle of law recognized by civilized nation, the question is, how do we determine which nation is civilized, and how do we determine which nation is not civilized? So that itself that's where have been a bone of contention within the international system, right? That how do we determine a civilized nation as against an uncivilized nation? It's a bone of contention, but in most cases, we're talking about the Western world as civilized nation. And those countries that the non-Western world have always argued that what makes the Western world civilized. So it's a serious bone of contention in which has led to a whole lot of debates as it is. And then another source of international laws are judicial decisions, right? Both international and domestic tribunals, teachings and writing of qualified publicists, qualified qualified judiciaries. So basically, they form part of the law. The decisions that are made by these tribunals, by courts, and the likes, they form part of the law, and they form a fundamental source to international law. So basically, these are some of the source of law in which we may look at. There's a whole lot. The list is beyond just these four that we just read: convention, customs, general principle of law, judicial decisions, and the likes. So why do states obey international law? These are questions in which you may want to ask yourself. In simple terms, we say that states obey international law because it is in their interest to do so. It's as simple as that. States obey international law because it's in their interest to do so. Like we said, because of the fusion of the world into a globalized whole, there is a state of lawlessness, anarchy. If there is no law and order within the international system, there's going to be chaos. There's going to be confusion. In order to avoid confusion, states obey international law. So you see, that's how we argue that it is in their interest to do so. So, like we said, recognition that reciprocity contributes to effectiveness in the international system. So, reciprocity contributes to effectiveness of international system. What do we imply by that? The space of you understand that what you do for me is what I will do for you. Mutual respect of each other. It contributes to the effectiveness of international law. Government also recognize the usefulness of that. Like I said, for you to maintain law and order, you need law. And obedience costs less than disobedience. Obedience to this law costs less because if you disobey the law, there are sanctions for disobeying the law. So we operate within that space. And like we said, certain sense of justice may also motivate the willingness to obey, right? Government prefers order and expectation over unpredictability and anarchy. That is what I just raised now. There's going to be chaos if there's no international law. But when there's law and order, then the system can operate better. So basically, these are some of the reasons why states operate international law. The list is also endless at this point. You can think of more, and I will encourage you to also read up on more. Just think about it. Why do you think states obey international law? Is something to think about. So, 4 major rights are asserted by states, right? There are rights as well as responsibility within the international system. And these are some of the rights in which the responsibility, or better still, let me start. The responsibility of the state is to obey the law. Now, these are the rights in which the states enjoy within the international system. First, we talk about the right of sovereignty. The recognition of sovereignty. It implies that each state respect the sovereignty of other states, right? They respect the sovereignty of the other state. That's why we have what we refer to as non-interference in the internal affairs of other states. Every state enjoying that space. It's a right. It's one of the major rights states enjoy within the international system. Non-interference within the internal affairs of the states. Right to sovereignty. Right to independence. Every state has right to pursue independence, to pursue its own independence. Free from detection, free from the influence of another state. It should not be that a state determines the affair of another state. Every state needs to be independent. So there's right to independence that each state enjoy within international law. And then we have what we refer to our right to self-defense. Every state have the right to self-defense. It have the right to protect itself against aggression, both internal and external aggression. If there's an aggression of a state that threatens the security of the state has the right to defend itself. According to Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, it specifically states that each state has the right to what? To defend itself. And then we talk about equality. We talk about equality. The legal claim that superior economy, military, or political power do not confer any special privilege on anybody. You are small or you are big, we are seen as equal before the law. So the United States is seen as equal to the smallest of the states within the international system. No matter how small they are, or no matter how poor the state is, it is seen as equal. It is seen as equal in the eyes of the law. So these are the rights in which the states enjoy. The right to sovereignty, the right to independence, the right to self-defense, and the right to equality. These are the four major rights that is enjoyed by the state within the international system. Now, moving on, we have what we refer to as critical issues that affect the performance of international law. Remember, we said, let me go back to the slide, that in the adequacy of international law requires legitimacy, requires acceptability, and requires what? Enforceability. But you realize that international law sometimes operates in such a way that it does not perform this jurisdiction. The law is technically weak at different times. So what are the issues that affect the performance of international law? We talk about jurisdiction. What do you mean by jurisdiction? International law involves mutual acceptance by government to formalize and safeguard their sovereignty within their specific territorial boundaries. So it affects the performance of international law in the sense that there is a need for mutual acceptance of all states. So if all states do not accept that particular law, then it becomes difficult for that law to operate within the territory of that particular state, right? So that becomes an issue of jurisdiction. So, and then we have the issue of extradition. The issue of extradition, the performance of extradition, is the practice whereby a criminal suspect is returned to the country where a particular crime is committed. For instance, if you commit a crime in Germany and you move to France, the principle of extradition requires that if there's a bilateral or multilateral agreement between Germany and France on the law of extradition, you are supposed to be returned back to where the crime has been committed for you to face the law in that space. So that's the principle of extradition. And in most cases, what people do is that they commit a crime in a particular place, and then they will move to a place whereby the law permits them to stay in that place. The law does not recognize that particular act as crime. And then they will go there. But under the space of extradition, they are supposed to be returned back to the space whereby the crime was committed for them to face the law. So basically, that's what it implies. And then we'll talk about extraterritoriality. It's a practice whereby citizens of one state are exempted from the jurisdiction of another, right? A situation whereby, so it is possible for you to commit a particular crime within a particular state, but you'll be exempted from facing the status of law within that space, right? So basically, that's the space of extraterritoriality. And then we have the special treatments in the sense of this is more of economy, right? In an economic area, and it's the special treatment is more or less for in countries whereby they're trying to bring in foreign investment. So you have things like free duty-free import, special discount for local purchase, and the likes. You give special professional treatments for all these things. And then the treatment that is given to diplomats and ambassadors and their residents when they are in foreign land, no matter the crime, the offense in which they commit, you cannot prosecute them under the principle of what? Extraterritoriality. It goes back to this principle of extraterritoriality in the sense that a crime committed within a particular state the person cannot be prosecuted under the principle. You have to return the person back to his country of origin. And that's also operates even for ambassadors and diplomats within their place of assignment. So basically, these are some of the issues that affect international law as it is. And then other factors that affect the performance of international law, we talk about lack of international institutions for clarifying and communicating the law. There are no institutions that clarify the law to everybody. for everybody to understand the law. And then there is no central belief system to serve as an obligatory authority for the law. What do we imply by that? The belief system, the orientation of each state differs. So for that reason, it becomes difficult for us to determine what is right and what is wrong. That becomes a challenge within the international system. And then, like we said, there's no effective central process of policing and imposing of sanction. Remember, we said that enforceability is a fundamental aspect in the adequacy of the law. But within international law, there is no effective central policing or system that impose sanction on perpetrators or violators of this law. So that becomes a challenge. And then most importantly, we said there's lack of consensus among states for a more effective law to govern their interaction. In most cases, there's no consensus. Look at a perfect example would be the issue of climate change and emission of greenhouse gases. We are yet to have rules, laws that are agreed by all on what to do as relating to the emission of greenhouse gases. So you see, that affects the performance of the international system. And then there's no recognized international legislature, recognized parliaments. There's no recognized world parliament. And there's no international department of justice that initiate legal action against states that violates law. So that itself is an issue within the international system. No international tribunal to hear dispute between states that are not obligated to submit, that are not, okay, like we said, no international tribunal to hear dispute between states, nor are states obligated to submit to any of such tribunals. For instance, when you talk about the International Criminal Court, for instance, it is not all states that are party to the court itself. So it does not apply to all states. So that becomes a challenge. When we have laws that apply to some states and does not apply to other states, it becomes a challenge within the international system. So basically, these are some of the points in which we want to look at today as relating to international law. We look at globalization and we say globalization is the fusion of the world, the coming together of the world, the increase in the connectivity of the world, as globalization. And we said globalization has three dimensions: economic, political, and cultural globalization. And we say there are different schools of thought in relation to globalization. We have the hyper-globalists, we have the realists, and we have the globalists. And we said that there's going to be a change in the roles and function of the states as globalization increases. And then we said international laws are the rules and regulations that helps in determining or controlling the behavior of states within the international system. And we said for the international law to be effective, it must be acceptable, it must be legitimate, and it must be enforceable. And we say there are different factors that hammer or disrupt the performance of the international system, of which we have discussed quite a lot. And then we said the international system, the subject of international system, the states, the non-governmental organization, multinational corporation, as well as the individuals. Both state and non-state actors are subject to international law. So basically, these are some of the things in which I just want us to look at today. So I'm just going to open the floor for question. Any question?
Not right now.
Yeah, not right now. But you'll send us the presentation again, right?
Yes, I will.
Okay.
And talking about that, I will send the last assessment we did. I will just send it with the mail. I don't know what you guys prefer. Am I supposed to send it to you guys individually, or it is fine I just send it as a bulk message to everybody? You all did well though, so.
Mm.
Personally, I don't care.
Okay. It's all right. I will send you the slide, and hopefully I'll also send each one your score for the last assessment we did.
Thanks.
Is that okay? Okay. If there are no questions, I think we'll end the class here, and I'll see you next week.
See you.
All right, till then.
Bye.
See you next week.